Hey quilty friends, welcome back to the next Accuquilt quilting classroom, brought to you with Accuquilt and Create and Craft TV. It's been a while, welcome back. I'm Stuart Hillard, and in today's quilting classroom I'm going to be talking you through all the many possibilities that you can achieve using your companion corners. Now, I've got a sampler quilt hanging on the wall behind me, and that's really going to be the focus of today's quilting classroom. A sampler quilt is a great way of getting to know a system or a technique or a set of techniques without the commitment of having to make a gazillion blocks. You've only got to make one of each, and you know, if you don't like making it, you don't have to make it again. But it also means that you can really focus in and learn lots of new techniques, learn lots of new ways of quilting, which are really going to expand your repertoire and your skills and all the possibilities. And that's what Accuquilt Companion Corners really offers. So let's have a little look at this sampler quilt that's on the wall. And this sampler quilt that we've got here is available as a free pattern download. So just follow the link at the bottom of the video and you can download that whole pattern for free. All the cutting instructions, the piecing diagrams, the whole shebang, and enjoy making it. And do remember to post your pictures online. So here's my sampler quilt. And it's made up of 9 blocks. We've got 5 key blocks using the corners, and they're in the 4 corners, and then also this one right in the center. But they're linked up by 4 more chain blocks, which bring the whole thing together, and then this lovely piano key and bow tie border. Now this whole sampler quilt can be made using your Qube and your companion corner set, and we're going to use every single die in the set, all 12 dies. So it's a really great way of getting to know your companion and your Qube as well. So let's get started and have a look at the companion corners. Now I've got my 8-inch Qube right here. So if you're going to buy a companion for your Qube, you want to make sure that you buy the same size as your Qube. So if you've got the 8-inch Qube like I've got right here, make sure you buy the 8-inch companion corners to go with it. Now our original Qube is dies 1 through 8, and our companion corners brings us right up to date. We've got die number 9, die number 10, and then we've got 11.1 and 12.1. I'll explain why the 0.1 in just a second. We're also, of course, getting, as always, your cutting mat and your DVD. So if you need a little refresher on how to use the system, maybe you haven't used it in a little while, shame on you. It'll just give you a little refresher about how to use your fabrics most efficiently. So let's have a little look at what you get inside your companion corners. So you're getting die number 9, and this is the chisel die. And the first thing that I want you to notice about the chisel die is it is directional. So when we cut our chisel shapes, we can cut left or right-sided chisels, or a combination of the two, and that really comes down to how you lay your fabric. We'll look at that more closely when we actually cut the chisels out. Now our next die, number 10, is what we call the signature die. It's called the signature die because traditionally this shape would be used for signature quilts. So you'd maybe cut this shape out of calico, unbleached muslin, something like that, solid. You would have someone sign their name, or maybe a birthday message, or a get well soon, or happy retirement through the center, which you might embroider. And then you add triangle corners and then piece it into a quilt. Lots of really lovely examples of signature quilts, but you can use it for a whole heap more. Now then, die number 11.1 is the bow tie, what we call the bow tie. And from a distance, this looks like an octagon, but what we've actually got are some blades running through the center. So this cuts 4 essentially squares with a triangle corner cut off. And pieced together, that's going to make our bow tie unit. So again, really useful, loads we can do with that. And then finally, we've got 12.1, which is our small half square triangle. This completes the bow tie when it's joined to the bow tie, but again can be used as a small half square triangle. Now, the reason why these dies are called 11.1 and 12.1 is you might have bought the original Comapnion Classics, the very first Comapnion that we brought out, which was the Chisel, the Signature, and the two halves of a Drunkard's Path. This is the updated Comapnion, and we've called it Comapnion Corners. We've taken out the Drunkard's Path and replaced it with 11.1 and 12.1, the bow tie and half square triangle units. Now, if you already have the Comapnion Classics, you can buy an upgrade. So you can buy just dies 11.1 and 12.1. And again, if you follow the link at the bottom of the video, you'll be able to purchase just the dies that you need. So these are our 4 dies in the Comapnion Corners. Let's get to do some cutting. It's time to cut out our corners. Let's start with the chisel. I've got my die right here, and I'm using the Go Big. All electric, all automated, no hand cranking. Love it. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, the chisel is a directional shape. Most of the shapes in the Qube, 7 out of 8 of them, are non-directional. They're completely symmetrical, so it doesn't matter if we fan fold our fabric. And normally that's how we lay our fabric. We're gonna take our die, we're gonna take our strip of fabric, cut from selvage to selvage, and we're going to lay it over our shape with the seam allowance running on the lengthwise grain, so it goes through the length of the machine. And then we're going to fan fold our fabric up to 6 layers to cover that shape. Now, if we do that with a directional shape, what we will end up with is 3 chisel shapes with the diagonal going this way, and 3 chisel shapes with the diagonal going that way. So we'll get 3 left and 3 right. Now, for most patterns, in fact for all of the designs in my sampler, you want right and left, and you want equal numbers of chisels. But if you wanted to place a particular fabric in a particular position, make sure you think about that before you cut your patches. Otherwise, you'll end up cutting extra patches that you don't need. They'll always come in handy for something, but if you've only got a small amount of fabric, you don't want to waste it. So, if you're going to cut patches that all go the same way, rather than fan folding your fabric, what you'll need to do is actually stack it. So in order to stack fabric, all you need to do is measure the shape that you're cutting, add about ½ an inch to that width, or you can just do it by eye, and then cut sections of fabric to that width. And then rather than placing them right side down, right side up, place them all either with the pretty side of the fabric facing up towards you, or with the pretty side facing down. And that way, when we cut, instead of having one of each, one left and one right, we'll end up with 2 shapes that are exactly the same. Okay? So that's by doing it stacked. And if I just cut again using our traditional fan folding method, and I'll show you what we get instead. So by the traditional fan folding method, where we've got pretty side up and pretty side down, what we end up with this time is one of each, one left and one right. Now for my sampler quilt, as I mentioned earlier, this is what we want. We want one of each. So keep that in mind. So those are our chisel shapes, and we use those in 3 out of the 4 star blocks in our quilt. Now the next shape that we're going to cut out is the signature. I'm going to use a different fabric for that. We'll use a light fabric. Now this shape is non-directional, so we can go back to our familiar fan folding method. Now one of the questions I get asked all the time is, Stuart, why are the shapes wonky on the die? Why aren't they straight? And you can see on the chisel and the signature die as well that rather than being straight on the die, they're at a very slight angle. And the reason for that is when your die goes through the machine, we don't want one straight blade to come into contact with those rollers at the same time. We want to stagger that cut. And by putting that shape at an angle, this part will hit the rollers first and then it will travel across, and it just creates a really nice smooth passage through your machine. The other question that I get asked, which is absolutely related to that, is what do I line my fabric up with? Do I line it up with the shape or do I line it up with the die? We absolutely want to line it up with the shape that you're cutting because you want the shape to be on the straight of grain. So I like to take my selve edges off, nice and straight, and then I will lay that straight edge next to one of the straight edges on the shape that I am cutting. And I will then fan fold, and I like to fan fold as close to the edge of the shape as I possibly can to really minimize any waste when I'm cutting. And we'll cut 4 out. This excess fabric, I don't cut off. I leave it on, so long as it's not getting trapped on anything, it's fine to leave it there. And by not cutting off the fabric, it means that when I cut my next shapes, I can butt that cut edge right up against the shape, again, to really minimize any waste. Signature shapes cut, and that's what I'm talking about, minimal waste. We love that. And then there we've got our 4 signature shapes all cut out, and we can create crosses, we can create circles, we can create really strong diagonals. So much that you can do with this shape. It's really, really versatile. So those are our signature shapes, and that's die number 10. Now the next shape that we're going to cut is the bow tie, die number 11.1. And again, let's cut this out with some light fabrics. So this cuts out 4 shapes at a time. I only want to cut 4, so I'm just going to use one single layer of fabric. If you've got any creases on your fabric, you always want to make sure to iron those away. Don't try and cut creased fabric, because as your die goes through the machine, it's going to flatten out that crease and then it will spring back. And the shape that you end up cutting may not necessarily be the shape that you wanted. So always use nicely pressed fabric. Okay. And here we've got our bow tie backgrounds. And again, you could absolutely cut these out and piece them together and create the look of an octagon, but traditionally I'm going to use it in the same sort of way that we always would, which is as a bow tie for this quilt. Okay, so we'll pop those there. And the last unit that I need to cut are some half square triangles, and these are the small ones. And I'm going to use a dark fabric for those. So let's use this lovely rich dark brown. And again, we always want to try and use our fabric on the lengthwise grain. It's the most stable grain on your fabric. And so that's particularly important when you're die cutting. The fabric's going through the rollers at high pressure, and you want the fabric to be as stable as possible. The lengthwise grain is going to do that. Another top tip when we're talking about lengthwise grain is when you're cutting fabric for the borders on a quilt, that outside edge on your quilt is the most vulnerable to stretch when you're handling your quilt top, when you're sewing your border on, and when you're quilting. And it's the place that you can end up with that ripple, that telltale ripple edge, particularly noticeable on things like wall hangings. If you cut your border fabric on the lengthwise grain, it'll be much more stable, you'll get a better result. It's definitely worth trying. This is so easy cutting. And there are my half square triangles, all cut out. Many, many small half square triangles. I think that would be a great die to use up little tiny scraps for and make a little half square triangle quilt. So you could piece those, just use those in a quilt. Need lots of patience. Okay, so we've cut out all of the pieces. Now let's have a look at how we're going to put them together to make those blocks for my sampler quilt. Now let's have a little look at the individual blocks that you're going to make for your sampler. Remember, there's a free pattern download that has the diagrams on it. Now what you'll notice is that quite a lot of the units that are used for the sampler quilt are really familiar patchwork units. 4 patches, half square triangles, flying geese. If those phrases that I'm using are like a foreign language to you right now, what I want you to do is I want you to watch the very first quilting classroom that we did here on Create and Craft with Accuquilt, because that was a basic patchwork sampler using those basic units. And in that video, I show you how to make flying geese and half square triangles and things like this, the square on point, or square in a square unit. So I'm not going to show you how to make those units in this video. We're moving on a little bit, but if you need some extra tuition on how to piece those units, just go back to that very first video and watch that when you've finished watching this one. So a number of the star blocks that I've used in the sampler have a square on point as the center. And in our first sampler star, which is in the top left corner, we've got some 4 patch units, and I've used die number 2 to make these 4 patch units, and I've got 4 of them. And making these is as easy as cutting out simple squares using die number 2. Yeah, I'm just arranging them, 2 lights and 2 darks. I'm going for a bit of a neutral look here. Yeah, and then sewing these together and pressing, sewing these together and pressing, and then joining them. You know, it's as simple as that. What makes the whole job so much easier is when your shapes are cut precisely and perfectly, which Accuquilt always does. So I'll pop those out the way. So we've got our 4 patch units, and then this is where the companion corners comes in, because I'm going to use the chisel shape, and I will be showing you how to piece this unit. And so what I've got is 4 identical chisels that slope one way, and then another 4 that slope the other way. Okay, so for the very first star, which is in that top left corner, you're going to make 4 patches, 1 square on point. You're going to make 4 chisels sloping one way, 4 chisels sloping the other. And when you piece these units, once you've got to this stage, it's as simple as sewing them together and making sure that you've got them all nicely pressed. And then you can join those units into rows and join the rows together. So that's your first star using the chisel shape. Now the second block that I'm going to explain is really similar. I've just changed a few elements, and this is a great way of expanding your patchwork block repertoire. You can use exactly the same elements, just position them slightly differently, twist and turn them, and hey presto, you've got a new block. I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands of variations. We're going to keep the center the same. It's still a square in a square or a square on point, and that just uses die number 6 from your cube for the center and die number 5 for the triangle corners. Okay, so nice easy unit to make. So we use that as a center. We've still got our 8 chisel units, 4 facing one way, 4 facing another. You could mix up those colors. In the corners of the block, you'll notice that we've still got 3 squares out of the 4, but the 4th square has been replaced with a half square triangle. So again, that's just using die number 5, cut a light and a dark, or maybe 2 medium or 2 dark, but quite contrasting colors. You want a decent amount of contrast, which is what I've done with mine. And then we're just going to place those triangles, and we will piece that together when we make our 4 patch. Now, what I've done on my sampler quilt is I've put that diagonal pointing diagonally out from the center. So 2 half square triangles stitched together, use a nice even 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout. And you know, when you're piecing multiple units together to make a block, especially when you've got units of different sizes or different numbers of seams, that's when you really notice whether your seam allowance is accurate or not. So before you start piecing anything, always do a little seam allowance check. But I'll just finish by showing you this. So we've got our 4 half square triangle corners, totally changes the look of the block. Let me show you one other little variation. If you fancied, you could turn those units so that the strongly coloured half square triangle was pointing inwards or outwards. That's another variation. And again, you've changed the look of the block. You could take any one of these blocks and do a whole quilt of just that one block. But see how different that looks just by turning that one element. So that's block number 2. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to give you another top tip, because I want your patchwork units to fit together perfectly every single time. And you know, that really comes down to cutting accurately and sewing accurately. Now, the cutting accurately is all taken care of with Accuquilt. Your pieces are going to be precision cut. We know that they are going to be perfect. So that is a massive tick. We're already ahead of the game. But we need to make sure that when we piece our patches together, we're using an accurate seam allowance. And here's a little thing that you can do, and that I do at the start of every project, just to make sure that that day I am sewing a really good seam allowance. I cut 3 rectangles using my cube. I used die number 8. On my 8-inch cube, this is going to cut rectangles which are 2.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches in length. But it doesn't matter what size cube you've got, you can do exactly the same. So 3 rectangles. And what I want you to do is I want you to sew 2 of those rectangles together side by side. And I've overlapped them slightly to show you what they would look like when they were stitched together. So sew them together using your 1/4 inch seam allowance and press your seam. And then what I want you to do is I want you to get your 3rd rectangle and I want you to sew it to the top. Now, your rectangle should fit absolutely perfectly. Okay. If your 1/4 inch seam allowance is absolutely spot on, that rectangle will fit the top. Now, if it does, brilliant, perfect, massive tick, you know, have a biscuit, have a, you know, a celebration, today's a good day. If that rectangle doesn't fit, it's 2 things. It could be too big. If that rectangle hangs over the edge, then your seam allowance is too big and you need to reduce the size of it. And that might be about putting a piece of masking tape down on your sewing machine bed to show you where to lay your fabrics. It might be about moving the needle over either to the left or to the right on your machine. It might be about just having slightly less or slightly more fabric underneath your presser foot. If the rectangle is too small, then your seam allowance is too small. And again, you need to make it a little bit bigger. So if you do that simple test at the start of every project, it will just keep you on that straight and narrow path and mean that when you try putting your units together, they just fit, which is wonderful. It's always a good day when that happens. So we've looked at blocks 1 and 2. Let's look at block 3, which we're going to do the bottom right, okay? So again, not massive changes here. I've taken out the square on point from the center and I've replaced it with another 4 patch. Now you could mix up the colors. You could have the colors stay the same. If you wanted to, you could ignore my pattern and put half square triangles in the center, or 4 of them. I mean, don't be afraid to mix things up a little bit. But the other thing that I have done is, or where the real change is in my 4 patches out in the corner. Because what I've done there is I've replaced my 2 light squares with half square triangles, okay? And I've replaced them like this. So I'm going to show you just in the top corner of this block how they would look. So we've got half square triangles pointing out. And this creates a secondary star around the first one made out of chisels. Again, it's one simple change, completely changes the look of the block. That's star block number 3. Now, star block number 4, we're actually using a different unit. We're not using chisels. So I'm going to get rid of these. We're actually using the parallelogram. Now, the parallelogram is from the original Qube, and I would say it is probably the one most underused die in the whole Qube. And I think the reason for that is it's maybe a little bit scary to some of us, because it's not one of those shapes that we've perhaps used that much before. I've already pieced these units, and I will be showing you how to piece these in a moment. I'm going to lay these down and show you their position. And we've got 8 identical units. And these create a fantastic chevron, really strong look. And then in the center, I've used that square on point. So what we end up there with is a star in the center, and then another sort of chevron star that appears around it. Now my corner units, again, I have changed. This is another fantastically versatile unit, and it's made using some half square triangles using die number 2, and I've also used die number 3, I beg your pardon, which is the large triangle, okay? And so what we've got here are 2 small triangles, die number 5, and last of all, we've got 1 square. Okay, and this creates that corner unit. Let me move it up into position. There we go. And that's our corner unit. And we've got 4 of those, just to show you how they're going to look. again with that unit in the corner. Now piecing that corner unit is not difficult at all, but it's slightly different to the usual kind of two squares together, rectangles together. What you're going to do is lay out your pieces in the position that you want to sew them in, so you can do a visual check, make sure they're all in the right position, and then just separate them out into two triangles, okay? And then our next job that we're going to do is we're going to flip our small triangle against the square and sew our 1/4 inch seam allowance, flip it back and press it, and then we're going to do the same with this triangle, right sides together, sew our 1/4 inch seam allowance and flip it back. Now the real acid test when you have sewn those 3 patches together is to lay your large triangle on top. They should fit together, and this is always one of those times when you're placing a pieced patch next to a sort of solid patch, a whole patch. If they fit together, you know you've done your cutting and your piecing just right. If they don't fit together, this is where you want to start adjusting your seam allowance a little bit. Either your seam allowance is a little too small or it's a little bit too big. This is why it's always worth piecing 1 unit before you even piece the 4 units that you need for a block. Why make the same mistake 4 times? Make it once, correct it, and never go back. All right, so that's our corner unit for star block number 4. The final main block that we've got is right in the center of our quilt, and that uses the signature. So here we go. I've got 4 signature units, and these are going to create corners. What you might have noticed already about all of these blocks is that they're based around a 9 patch. A 9 patch is one that's got 9 units, 3 rows of 3, okay, something else in the middle, okay, so we've got 9 units sewn together. Our cube is based around a 4 patch, so 4 units sewn together, and that's where we get our 8-inch cube, because that would be 8 inches finished. Because we're using 3 rows instead of 2 rows, we've got an extra unit added on. All of our blocks are going to be 1.5 times the size of your cube. So your 6-inch cube is going to make 9-inch blocks. Your 8-inch cube is going to make 12-inch blocks, and so on and so forth. In the downloadable pattern, I've given you the finished sizes of that sampler quilt using all 4 sizes of cube. So you can make anything from a 33-inch square sampler to a 66-inch square sampler, and 2 sizes in between. So let's just go back to our block number 5, that center block. So we've got our signature units, which are going to go in the corners. Now we're also going to cut some rectangles. This is using die number 8. Okay. And they're going to go around the sides. And remember, I mentioned right at the start, you're going to use every single one of your dies. So this is a really good way of getting to know your system. We're also going to piece some flying geese units. And again, if you need to, go back to the original quilting classroom, number 1, where I show you how to make a simple sampler quilt. Just put those in the right position, that's better. And then last of all, we've got our square on point in the center, okay? And that's going to make that 5th block right in the center. So there are 5 main blocks. Now let's get to some piecing. Let me show you how easy it is to piece together those chisels and those bow ties and those signature blocks. So when you come to sew your chisel units, you're sewing your triangle number 5 to die number 9, which is your chisel. You're going to be sewing at an angle. You're going to be sewing on that diagonal. And because of that, you're only putting a very small amount of fabric underneath the presser foot on your machine. There's very little in contact with both the presser foot and the feed dogs that carry the fabric through your machine. And it's for that reason that this is the key time that your sewing machine gets hungry and gobbles up your fabric. It always seems to happen, doesn't it, on those first few stitches. And the reason for that is there's so little fabric in contact with the feed dogs that rather than the fabric moving, it stays on one spot. The needle pushes the fabric down into the belly of your machine and we get knotted up. There's a really simple way of avoiding that happening and it works every single time. Okay? What you're going to do is drop your presser foot, and then you're going to take hold of your top and your bobbin thread, your right or left hand, it doesn't matter which. And as you take those first couple of stitches, you're just going to gently pull back on that thread. This will help to guide your fabric through your sewing machine for those first couple of stitches, okay? Now, once you've done it once, you probably won't need to do it for the second or third or fourth patches, particularly if you're chain piecing like I am. But if you get any problems at all, just continue just to pull back on that last patch just to get the next one going. Okay, so I've sewn a couple of patches there together. And I've used red thread so you can really easily see the seam line, okay? So I've stitched those. And then as always, I'm going to do a couple of stages in my pressing. I'm going to set my seam just by running my iron over the top of the seam. And then I'm going to use my fingers or my thumbs to finger press that unit back. And at this point, I'm checking for accuracy. And what I want to see here when I press it back is that the line of the triangle that I've added is exactly on the same line as the chisel. If those lines line up, and the back line lines up, I'm happy, okay? If it's not, then before you start putting any more heat or iron on this to set that seam and set that crease, you can take that seam allowance out and have another go. But as soon as you start pressing with an iron, you tend to sort of commit. You know, you put a real strong crease in that fabric, and it's very hard then to ever get rid of it. So finger press and check your accuracy first, and then commit with an iron. And stitching your chisel units is as simple as that. Once you've got a couple of units sewn together, you can seam them together. And again, I work without pins on these units. I line them up. Again, do my trick holding the thread and pull back. Clip your threads. Set your seam and then open it up, check for accuracy, and if you're happy with that accuracy, then you can press your seam allowances. Now on the chisel units, I'm going to give you a tip here. Normally I press my seam allowances one way or another. On the chisel units, I press my seams open. So again, I'm going to use my fingernail and I'm going to open that seam allowance up first of all. And then I'm going to go on top with the iron. And particularly if you're pressing rather than ironing, not a problem to use some steam. If you use steam and you're pressing, rubbing vigorously back and forth, you know, ironing vigorously, then you can distort your seams. But if you're pressing with steam, you're absolutely fine. And there we go. There's my chisel unit all made. Next unit that I'm going to show you is the signature unit. So this is using die number 10. And I've got a couple more half square triangles. And this is a really simple unit to make. We're just adding those triangles either side. And again, what I want you to notice is that because the dog ears have been clipped off, these triangles line up perfectly. There's no overhang on either side here and here. That overhang can really sort of hold you back on getting your corners nice and accurate. It's been all thought through by Accuquilt. The fact that they line up means that this point of the triangle, the apex of the triangle, is slap bang in the middle of that signature unit, which is right where we want it to be. Wouldn't this be a fun idea to do these signature blocks for a wedding or a christening and maybe pre-sew them all and have them in a basket, and then when the guests arrive you could have them all put their signature through the centre of a block, and then after the wedding you could sew all those units together and make a gorgeous quilt for the happy couple or for the christened baby. Loads of ways you can use this signature. And again, I'm using that same trick, just gently pulling back on the threads as I take my first couple of stitches, just to encourage it through the feed dogs. And again, I'm going to set my seams. I'm going to finger press them back. And again, here I'm looking for accuracy. And the accuracy that I'm looking for is that when I've pressed this triangle back, that the line of the triangle meets the line of the signature. If it's overhanging or it's underhanging, I know my seam allowance is just a little bit off, and I can go back in, maybe take that seam out and re-sew it. But if you're happy with your accuracy, you can then go in with your iron. Another thing that using that finger pressing technique helps to eliminate are those little tucks or pleats that we so often get where we've sewn two patches together. If we go straight in with an iron, you get that little concertina effect where there's a little bit of extra fabric that's folded over. If you finger press first, you'll find you eliminate that issue altogether. So that's our signature unit all done and dusted. Now, the last thing that we need to piece together are our bow tie units and our parallelograms. Let's piece the signature block. Really nice, easy one this, and so versatile. You're going to use this in loads of different blocks. We've already cut out our signature patch. Keep in mind that this line here and this edge here are both on the bias. So minimal handling. Okay, don't play with your blocks. I'm going to grab a couple of small half square triangles. This is using die number 5, and they're going to create the square. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just flip that triangle over, and what I want you to notice is how perfectly that triangle fits on, and there's no overhang. If we had rotary cut these triangles and they had pointy ends, those triangle ends would overhang, and it would be really difficult. We'd have to make a judgment where we placed them. They wouldn't just fit, and that would affect where the apex of the triangle, this point here, lies. Now, because those dog ears are cut off, automatically the apex of the triangle is going to be slap bang in the center where it needs to be. Now again, remember my tip about working with bias edges. I prefer not to pin. I find pinning distorts the edge. Minimal handling, keep everything nice and flat, and when I'm sewing, I'm going to hold on to my threads, I'm going to pull them gently back as I take my first stitch, and then my fingers are going to kind of act like 3 or 4 pins. I'm going to spread them over the patch and hold it down flat, and that's effectively doing what your pins would do. As I get nearer to my fingers, obviously I'm going to move them back and move them out the way, but I'm holding down that patch exactly where I want it to be all the time, effectively doing the job of my pins. Clip the threads off, and then I'm going to add another triangle to the other side, and again, perfect fit every time. Hold on to your threads and pull them back as you take those first couple of stitches, and then lay your fingers down on top of the patch to act like pins. Hold everything flat, Good. Unit done. So set your seams. Remember, setting seams literally means take your patches from your machine as you've sewn them, iron on top, and that heat just helps to shrink back the stitches a little bit, bed the stitches into the fabric, which creates a flatter, more accurate patch. Then I'm going to finger press my triangles back, and I'm going to check for accuracy. When I talk about checking for accuracy, what I'm looking for here is that the line of my triangle matches the line of my signature shape in both directions, and check all the way around. And if you're happy with that, you can go in with your iron that nice and flat. And again, try not to wiggle your iron around too much, so we don't want to distort our patch. And that's our signature unit, all done and dusted. We've got 2 more units to piece, and they are the parallelogram and the bow tie. So we'll start with the bow tie. This is the last 2 parts of the companion corners. Now then, let me just lay out the pieces first of all. So here we go. We've got our bow tie piece, which is that square with the triangle cut off. We've got our little half square triangles, and they fit on the corner. And then what I can also use for this, now there's options. I'm going to use the small squares, die number 2, and this is going to create the bow tie. Now you could use the exact same fabric as the small half square triangles, which would create a very sort of solid looking bow tie. I like to mix my fabrics up a little bit. But also, if you wanted to switch this block up, look, we could use the half square triangles there instead. And that's going to create a different look again. So many different options. And really, once you've made a few of these units, especially if you make a few extras, you can have a good old play. You know, just mix around your patches, take lots of photographs, and create a library of units. And then when you come to maybe design your own quilts, or you want to, maybe you don't like a block in a quilt and you think, I'd like to replace that with something else. What have I got that I could use? Go to your library of blocks that you've created and use those instead. So let's piece together those bow tie sections. Now, I remember when my companion corners arrived, I thought, gosh, piecing these little triangles is going to be really hard. It's so easy. Sometimes you just got to take a leap of faith and do it and see how easy it is. Again, dog ears are clipped off, so that patch is going to line up beautifully. Right sides together. Pop it underneath the foot. Hold on to your threads. And again, we're just using that scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to sew across. I'm going to stitch 2. You'll need 2 per bow tie unit. Now I've used these in my chain block. There are 4 of those chain blocks in the quilt, but I've also used them out in the corners of the border. If you didn't want to use those, you could put plain squares, die number 1, 4 patch, die number 2. Put some flying geese, but I think it's really nice to echo the bow ties from the center of the quilt in the border. And using your cube and companions to create your borders is going to create what I call a natural fit border. It's a natural fit because you're using exactly the same elements, exactly the same size pieces as you are in the body of your quilt. So it stands to reason that it will fit together and it will have a natural fit. So I've set my seams. I'm going to finger press those corners back and check for accuracy. I'm going to give a final press. And then I'm going to piece this together like a normal 4 patch. So I said right at the start I wasn't going to show you how to piece a 4 patch, but you know what? I fibbed. I'm going to show you how to piece together your bow tie. So we're just going to flip right over left, and we're going to stitch. Again, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then we're going to get the next patch right over left, line up those edges and stitch. And here I'm going to leave my 2 units stitched together, okay? They're still joined by a little bit of thread. That little bit of thread is going to act like a center pin to hold the center of my block together. I'm finger pressing my seam allowance towards die number 2, the small square, okay? And then I'm going to fold top to bottom. I've got my center point held by a little bit of thread, and I can stitch that unit together and boom, we're done. Quick press and a finger press, and then finally press the block nice and flat. And there we go, there's our bow tie unit all stitched together. No pins needed, use your fingers like pins. Just don't try and push them through the fabric, that won't work. Okay, last unit to do is the parallelogram. Now, the parallelogram throws me every time. And the reason why it throws me every time is because it comes off the die looking like this, but we're going to use it like this, okay? So it's just that slight turn so that we know how these pieces go together. So it ends up with like a kind of wide chevron. I always seem to want to put them together like this, which makes a kind of narrow chevron, but that's not how they go together. They go together like this in a wide chevron. What I need to do here is to add some half square triangles, and this is where you can mix things up a little bit, because you could put different colours at the top and the bottom, and that's what I've done in my quilt to create quite a strong star effect. Okay, so let me show you how you piece these. Now, this is the one unit you have got to really treat with kid gloves, because you've got 2 very long bias edges and we don't want to stretch those. So we're not going to pin, we're going to handle very minimally, and we're just going to be really kind of gentle. So I'm going to flip that triangle unit up and I'm going to stitch. Now, when you're stitching along a bias edge, you can quite inadvertently pull those edges out of shape, okay, just by the sort of very active stitching. So we just need to be really sort of super gentle as we're sewing, but these are nothing to be afraid of. Just require careful handling. Okay, so we're going to hold that very stable and we're going to stitch. Okay, and we'll just clip those threads off. So there's my seam all sewn, and if I just flip that back and finger press gently. Okay, super. Now we're going to do the same with the top. When you've got sort of a particular fabric in a particular position, it's really worth doing 1 or 2 units on their own before you start chain piecing, that kind of factory style, just to get into the habit of what goes where. And then when you've got your right and left versions, lay them out in front of you and lay all of your other patches on top. And then maybe sew all of the right-handed patches, and then sew all the left-handed patches. And it really sort of helps to organise yourself. Okay, so there's my parallelogram unit. It's not difficult to sew at all. Let's quickly sew the other one, and then we can join them together. Now, while I'm doing that, I'm just going to talk you through the border of the quilt. Now, what I've done is I've stitched my 9 blocks together. So that's 4 star blocks, that 1 centre block using the signature die, and then I've also got those 4 what what I call bow tie chain blocks. And wouldn't that be a fun alternative to doing just a 9-patch chain or a single Irish chain? Make them bow ties instead. Great scrap buster. Once you've sewn those together into 3 rows of 3, you want to give that unit a press, and then you're going to piece your border. Now, there's 2 options for piecing the border. We call it a piano key border. Now, you can either use die number 8, which is your rectangle, and cut a whole bunch. There are 18 rectangles in each of the 4 borders, and you can sew those together individually. That's how you can use your Qube to make the piano key border. Now, a quicker way of making that piano key border is to use a strip die. Cut some long strips, okay, sew them together and press, and then subcut using your rotary cutter. Now, you can do that if you have a strip die which is compatible with your Qube. Now, what you'll need is a strip die which is 1/4 of the size of your Qube. So if you've got the 8-inch Qube like me and you've got your 2.5-inch strip die, boom, boom, happy days. Most of us have got that 2.5-inch strip die. That's going to fit perfectly. If you've got your 6-inch Qube, you're using your 6-inch Qube, you would need to have a die that creates 1.5-inch finished strips. So the 2-inch strip die. If you're using your 12-inch Qube, you'll need a 3.5-inch strip die, 3-inch finished strips to create that piano key border. Now, if you haven't got a strip die that's compatible, 1/4 size of the Qube, just use die number 8. It's just a slightly longer process to create that border. Okay, just going back to these parallelograms, I've got my 2 sewn now, a right and a left, and all we need to do is to sew them together, and we've made all the units necessary for my sampler quilt. I haven't given fabric requirements in the pattern, and the reason why I've done that is because I love scrappy quilts, and I love using what I've already got at home or in my studio. And I really encourage you to do the same. And one of my favourite things to do when I'm creating a scrappy quilt is to use look-alike fabrics. So I might use 3, 4, 10 different turquoise fabrics, and I'll mix them up, and they'll pop up all over the place. And then if I run out of one of them, hey, it's no big deal. I'm never going to be on the internet at 3 a.m. trying to source that fabric from a shop in Nicaragua. Because I know people who've done that because they need to find that fabric. I'll just substitute another turquoise or aqua fabric in its place. It's very liberating, and it makes for a much more relaxed process. So give that a try. If you run out of one fabric, just substitute a look-alike. And there we go. I've sewn those units together, and I just want you to see that even without using pins, because of the accuracy of Accuquilt and an accurate seam allowance, those points match up exactly where I want them to be. You see, better cuts really do make better quilts. I hope you've enjoyed this quilting classroom brought to you by Create and Craft and Accuquilt, me, Stuart Hillard. And if you don't already subscribe, make sure you click the subscribe button down below, and make sure that we notify you every time there's a new video. Be really interested to see your versions of my sampler quilt, and download the pattern as many times as you like and give it to your friends, and let's spread the love. Until next time, take care. I will see you soon.